I'm going to talk about the name of my presentation is The End of Materialism and the Civilisational Crisis. I think it is a bit of a heretic topic, but still. I will read out my paper because English is not my mother tongue, so it's easier. Can you hear me? Okay. Materialism is a foundational doctrine of Western contemporary thought. It has formed contemporary Western mentality and modern science in a thorough and universal way. Materialism can be found in other cultures like the Carvaka School of Philosophy in India, but nowhere is it so important and constitutional as it is in the West. Materialism supports our science, our economies, our technologies, our societies, and above all, our beliefs. There's no questioning this fundamental creed of our civilization. Few have questioned it, like Whitehead or Bergson, and they have been discredited for that. Materialism often goes hand in hand with atomism, determinism, reductionism, atheism, and individualism in the history of Western philosophy. Leucippus, Democritus, and Epicurus in ancient Greece are usually seen as the first materialists of Western culture. Matter is a fundamental entity of the world and was seen until the beginning of the 20th century as it was in Leucippus' time. Matter is something that fills up space and as such is impenetrable and persists through time. The duration of things is as irrelevant as the influence of time on space. At the beginning of the 20th century, the concept of matter was changed by the novel stances of contemporary physics. However, as energy emerged as the equivalent of solid matter, materialism remained the fundamental philosophical and practical pillar of science. In our world, reality is usually taken as what results from a description of materiality. One may wonder if this is a rigorous and complete assessment of our surrounding environment. Immutable, purposeless material bodies with no duration, which can only be moved around and placed in different positions, are presented to us as the fundamental building blocks of reality. These material bodies may be minute, but they are still solid in some way. This is what Bergson called the logic of solid bodies, a constant frame of mind throughout Western thought. This frame of mind is also the foundation of the scientific corpus, as well as that of philosophies and ideologies. This leads to what Whitehead describes as the bifurcation of nature, and we have been talking about it quite a lot in this conference. The dissociation and severance of our perception and mind from the surrounding world. In considering ourselves disconnected from nature, numerous flawed theories emerge, such as individualism and materialism. Everything is taken by itself, in isolation from everything else. Successive crises also arise, be they economic and financial, social, ecological, or health crises. In fact, they are only one crisis, the systemic crisis of materialism. As we look around our world, we sense current values are no longer credible, even when they are traded as avant-garde thought and presented as a new awakening of our culture. Our successive, disconnected crises no longer allow for the previous intellectual frameworks, least of all for the same old habits and ingrained lifestyles. As our civilization breaks down, some people come to realize the need to recognize that all things are interconnected. A new society based on relationship instead of individual whim tentatively seems to emerge as an alternative. But this is a daunting process. The loss of connection with our surrounding world to which we belong leads us to see it as purposeless and as having no inherent intrinsic value per se. Our societies tend to organize themselves in isolated units, regardless of past and even present context. They are composed of disconnected elements that sometimes seem to assemble, keeping their distances and ignoring the possibility of establishing a true connection. We take reality as a naturally fragmented environment where we can move at will. Reality can be seen as a set of disconnected bits of information that can be listed in a sequence. That very sequence enables the possibility of putting together divergent information, which is never actually strewn together, taken in, and understood by a human being. Ultimately, we can use some information in a functional way so that a few everyday gadgets work. But we refrain from going further. No real human relationship remains in existence. No real human understanding becomes possible. Our values system is based on attributes and rejects any ontological reciprocity and self-constituting worth. The commodification of life and of the natural realm, also known as natural resources, has significantly changed humanity and our planet. Value emerges from an arrangement, from a kind of implicit contract, a social agreement that is not challenged by the many and is pushed by the few. Living entities and natural things are worthless until some monetary value is ascribed to them by the imposition of artificial circumstances such as markets, industrial extraction, technological applications, international trade, health procedures, and so-called sustainable policies. Process philosophy establishes the importance of relationship, interconnection, the integrity of past and present, and the ontological worth of all entities. Materialism is hardly reconcilable with such a view. We will examine some relevant topics in Whitehead and Bergson's philosophies, which are most illustrative of both theories. We will then try to show how relevant process philosophy might be to overcome the systemic civilizational crisis. Whitehead's examination of the bifurcation of nature supports this processual worldview. The bifurcation of nature, a true consequence of materialism, excuses minds from being really material. The mind is taken as totally matching the brain. Nevertheless, it detaches itself from materiality to hover above nature and scrutinize it. The brain, or mind, is not engaged with the perceived fact because it is the disengaged perceiver. Perception and any mental activity are not part of the phenomenon that is observed and perceived. Notwithstanding, natural phenomena are considered to cause mental phenomena. This is a clear instance of the bifurcation of nature. Perception requires a subject and an object considered separately. Not so in process philosophy, namely in Whitehead's philosophy. For Whitehead, subject and object are considered in relation to each other. They are the two faces of the same coin. They relate to each other in such a way that they provoke a dialectical activity between the two. There are no clear-cut, passive objects lying around in nature and waiting to be apprehended by subjects with a mind. Perception emerges from experience, and elements of experience cannot be separated into subjects and objects. The subject-object distinction is only admissible when taken in abstraction. In Concept of Nature, I quote, "For natural philosophy, everything perceived is in nature. Natural philosophy should never ask what is in the mind and what is in nature. To do so is a confession that it has failed to express relations between things perceptively known, namely to express those natural relations whose expression is natural philosophy," unquote. Therefore, the perceiver and the perceived are both in nature. However, the common account of perception, whether we consider it from a scientific stance or from an everyday view, severs the subject from the object. Perception is considered to be caused by a phenomenon in nature that acts on the mind as its efficient cause. And I quote again from Concept of Nature. The whole notion is partly based on the implicit assumption that the mind can only know that which it has itself produced and retains in some sense within itself, though it requires an exterior reason both as originating and as determining the character of its activity, unquote. And thus, we distinguish between causal nature and apparent nature, what we see as the cause of our perception and what we see as nature. However, every being's ontological character rejects the bifurcation of nature. Both efficient and final causation are involved in the self-development of every actual entity. Perception is a whole, indivisible event that cannot be parted into the perceiver and the perceived. In Whitehead's philosophy, the perceiver, who is the subject of experience, is also the outcome of that very experience. That is what is perceived. It is called a superject. The relationship between what is usually called subject and object is so inextricably intertwined that the object causes the activity of the subject and the subject directs its action towards the object. There are no passive objects to be found waiting for a perceiving subject that may relate to them. And again, Concept of Nature. Our knowledge of nature is an experience of activity or passage. The things previously observed are active entities, the events. They are chunks in life of nature, unquote. There is this togetherness of mind and nature that shows that the mind is not a container of perceptions or thoughts. It is this togetherness in nature that accounts for perception and for thought. There is no separation of the perceived from the perceiver, and there are only active entities. Nature is passage. It is no collection of inert objects that need to be apprehended by minds at a certain instant of time. Whitehead writes in Concept of Nature. The process of nature can also be termed the passage of nature. I definitely refrain at this stage from using the word time, since the measurable time of science and of civilized life generally merely exhibits some aspects of the more fundamental fact of the passage of nature. I believe that in this doctrine I am in full accord with Bergson, unquote. And quote again, passage is not measurable except as it occurs in nature, in connection with extension. We talked about that yesterday. In passage, we reach a connection of nature with the ultimate metaphysical reality. The quality of passage in durations is a particular exhibition in nature of a quality which extends beyond nature. For example, passage is a quality not only of nature, which is the thing known, but also of sense awareness, which is the procedure of knowing. Durations have all the reality that nature has. The measurableness of time is derivative from the properties of durations, unquote. Passage, thus, expresses the togetherness in nature. Time experienced as duration is a fact of nature and the ultimate metaphysical reality. Measurable time distances itself from duration and should not be taken as real time that can be experienced. There are no static entities or instants in nature. Whitehead clarifies his concept of time in modes of thought. He writes, "It is nonsense to conceive of nature as a static fact, even for an instant devoid of duration. There is no nature apart from transition, and there is no transition apart from temporal duration. This is the reason why the notion of an instant of time, conceived as a primary simple fact, is nonsense. Beings are temporal entities. They come into existence and develop in time, in duration, or in transition. You can say all those three things. Whitehead refers to real temporal entities as actual entities or actual occasions. They are all that exists in the universe. Actual entities are causa sui, which means they are self-causing or self-creating, but they are also the result of their appropriation of previous actual entities. There are two kinds of causes to actual entities, one internal cause and another external cause. The internal cause is self-creation and can be designated as the final causation. The external cause is the result of antecedent occasions and can be called efficient causation. In nature, togetherness means these two types of causation, as well as their inextricable interflow. An actual entity will come into being in accordance with its subjective aim, that is, in accordance with its very nature, which is the true way of its self-constitution. This is final causation. On the other hand, an actual entity will take in past actual occasions in order to come into existence. Those preceding occasions are its efficient causation, and the act of taking in previous entities is what Whitehead calls apprehension. Final causation and efficient causation entwine, producing a new actuality. The togetherness of experience is instantiated by these complex, interdependent, and temporal units of being. Every actual occasion draws on the past to come into existence. Its inclusion in itself of previous occasions sheds light on its temporal character and enhances the process of coming into being as presupposing relation. All existence emerges from relationship. The interweaving of complex relations amongst beings could be described as the basic network of the world. Thus, the great importance of the past is patent for the understanding of connection and relationship in Whitehead's philosophy. The relevance of the ontological past is beautifully described in the writings of the French philosopher Henri Bergson. Bergson believes that our mind limits itself to avoid seeing anything that is not linked to an everyday material interest. Our perception is the result of our need to act. Our intelligent perception diminishes our real vision of the universe. It eliminates many qualitative nuances of our many perceptions. In every perception, a collection of perception fades away so that one most representative perception can emerge. Our concern is a practical one. We are only interested in whatever sheds light on our present situation. The brain makes that kind of choice in recalling only useful memories so that our present action can develop. Perception gets from the whole of reality only that which interests us. Perception goes hand in hand with action. Subject and object should not be separated. The relationship between subject and object is not a static one, like in Whitehead's philosophy. The experience of either the subject or the object will increase reciprocally the knowledge about either of them. For Bergson, reality is movement and change. The most obvious and immediate reality is our inner life. Inner life is akin to movement and change. For that reason, it is indivisible. We can see and touch change in our inner life. Inner life is a primordial experience, we could say, in Bergson. We usually break change into different pieces or states so that we can act upon the things that surround us, but change is indivisible. The same can be said about movement. We represent movement as a set of immobilities, and we ignore passage that takes us from one thing to the other. Ignoring these facts creates unsurmountable metaphysical problems. Our experience of our inner life gives us a direct vision of change and movement as sheer indivisibility. The indivisible character of real things leads to their undeniable temporality. True temporality requires the preservation of the entirety of the past, because change and movement, that is, the flux of things, is whole and indivisible. Ultimately, reality is pure change and movement. It is duration. Change and movement by themselves do not need some underlying body that changes or moves along with movement. What we have here is pure change and pure movement. Change and movement are not the attributes of some inert material bodies that suffer a modification or change their location. Bergson states this view, and I quote from La Pensée et le Mouvement, which was translated into English as the creative mind. There are changes, but under change, there are no changing things. Change does not need a support. There are movements, but there is no moving, inert, invariable object. Movement does not imply a mobile, unquote. That's very provocative, I think. The Bergsonian rejection of a support for change or a mobile for movement is the utter rejection of materialism. Reality is a flux of pure change and movement. It is pure duration. In Whiteheadian terms, it could be described as an inextricable series of pure events. According to Bergson, the indivisibility of change implies the preservation of the past in its entirety. The past determines every being, but there is no necessity or ineluctability in that determination. On the contrary, the past integrates the present and cannot be separated from it, leading to a continuous and incessant novel process of creation. This kind of omnipresent, indestructible past has an ontological, immaterial character. The past determines the constitution of the individual in a free and creative way. It is the foundation of the free act. There is no necessary determination of our action because past and present are one, constantly creating novelty. Thus, and I quote again from La Pensée et le Mouvement, no need to explain memory. The past automatically keeps itself. It is true that if we close our eyes to the indivisibility of change, to the fact that our most distant past adheres to our present and constitutes with it one uninterrupted change, it looks as if the past is normally what has been abolished, and the conservation of the past looks like something extraordinary. But if we consider the continuity of our inner life, and consequently of its indivisibility, it is not the conservation of the past that should be explained. On the contrary, we should explain its apparent abolition. We will no longer have to account for the memory, but for the oblivion, unquote. The integral conservation of the past and the very existence of free will elucidate the wholeness and indivisibility of change in a very clear way. The free act includes the whole of the ontological past and shows the emergence of creativity as the driving force of our inner life. It manifests itself in the unveiling of duration, and it is of a temporal nature. It is the outcome of duration and the result of the flow of our inner life. I quote again, this time from L'Essai sur les données immédiates de la conscience, which was translated into English as Time and Free Will. We represent deliberation as a kind of come and go in space, whilst it consists in a dynamic progress in which the I and its very reasons are in a continuous becoming, like true living beings. The I, infallible in its immediate observations, feels free and declares it, unquote. Freedom is the outcome of our ontological and immaterial past that expresses itself in a novel and creative way. The ontological past is not distinguishable from the present. It is there in its wholeness and indestructibility, and it accompanies the ever-changing flux of things. Gilles Deleuze referred to the Bergson's ontological past as being contemporary to the present. Freedom emerges from the novelty that results from becoming and is determined by the past. Duration has this creative and novel aspect, notwithstanding its source that feeds on the past. But the antecedent constitutional flux, although determinant, is not deterministic. Will is real and comes into being with the incessant flow of things. Duration is the root of freedom and the root of life and existence. Bergson believes in a similar way to Whitehead's that every living being creates itself. This development, like evolution, adopts the sheaf mode, gerbe in French, sharing the vital impetus, that's the translation of l'élan vital, in all directions with every other living being. Bergson says there is nothing mysterious about this. I quote from Les Deux Sources, the two sources of morality and religion. It simply expresses the fact that a tendency is the forward thrust of an indistinct multiplicity, which is moreover indistinct and multiplicity only if we consider it in retrospect, when the multitudinous views taken of its past undivided character allow us to see it composed of elements which were actually created by its development. Unquote. Bergson rejects any kind of determinism and thus absolute finalism. The tendency towards life is an indivisible movement, and it can only be considered as something divisible after the process of becoming has been completed. The aim of an action cannot be given in advance, but we tend to see what is in process as something that is already settled and static. This is the way our intelligence works. Our thoughts aim at action. Our intelligence has molded itself in accordance with our needs to act upon our environment. We picture ourselves an end before we act upon reality. When we anticipate the future, drawing on our past and finding similarities in nature so that we can plan for the future. We act applying the laws of causality, and our representation of a future aim is but the representation of something we believe to be like it and drawn from our past. External finalism establishes in advance what should not be predictable and what has not happened yet. Life is supposed to be realizing a pre-established plan. This kind of belief is a pre-given goal. In a pre-given goal can only be verified after the event has taken place. It encompasses a retrospective illusion, l'illusion rétrospective, to use the expression coined by Vladimir Yankelevich. This kind of finalism overlooks the creativity of life and its unpredictable novelty. It fabricates and represents life as a collection of fragmented bits that we can analyze in a reversed order. This fragmentation in reversed order completely erases duration, emptying life of its vitality and creativity. Fragmentation and order inversion result from the same procedure. This is the way we act upon the world. Our intelligence needs to focus on static things. It needs to break them into pieces and reassemble them back again. We call this analysis, and we judge it to be the best way to know the world around us. But life is whole and indivisible. It cannot be assembled and reassembled arbitrarily for our analysis. Bergson writes in Introduction to Metaphysics, analyzing then consists in expressing a thing in terms of what is not it. In its eternally unsatisfied desire to embrace the object around which it is condemned to turn, analysis multiplies endlessly the points of view in order to complete the ever-incomplete representation. Varies interminably the symbols with the hope of perfecting the always imperfect translation. It is analysis ad infinitum, but intuition, if it is possible, is a simple act, unquote. Our intelligence works through these analytical methods, but life is indivisible. There are plenty of indivisibility examples in Bergson's philosophy. One of them is the free act, as we've seen, which manifests itself in its wholeness, temporality, and unexpectedness. We grasp wholeness through intuition, because intelligence cannot do it through analysis. And I quote again from La Pensée et le Mouvement, we call intuition the sympathy by which one is transported into the interior of an object in order to coincide with what there is unique and consequently inexpressible in it, unquote. We don't attain intuition by slowly improving our intellect. Intuition is the result of one of those sudden leaps by which evolution develops. Intuition is beyond our intelligence. It is the way we apprehend life, its profound meaning, and the manifestations of true novelty. It is the way we integrate the past in the present. Ultimately, intuition may lead to the final leap towards our status of adjutores Dei. Bergson holds that the last stage of human evolution is mysticism. The mystic state requires a huge effort, a truly free effort that develops amidst an overabundance of vitality. Reason is long overcome. Wholeness and intuition emerge as the novel enabling reality, which includes the past in the present. In Whitehead's philosophy, the ontological past also sustains the constitutional aspect and thus the intrinsic value of every being. Value results from the process. Every actual entity has worth for the very reason that it came into being. The process of coming into being creates value, and value is the outcome of experience. In Modes of Thought, Whitehead writes, our experience is a value experience. At the base of our existence is the sense of worth. It is the sense of existence for its own sake, of existence with its own justification, of existence with its own character. The very condition of existence is a manifestation of worth. Value is thus of an ontological nature. It cannot be created through agreement or convention. It comes with existence. It is not added or conceded to existing beings. Value is inherent to existence and thus to every being. In Whitehead's philosophy, value is also most relevant for the understanding of evolution. A theory of evolution is not compatible with true materialism. According to the materialistic doctrine, evolution is a set of external, spatial relationships between material bodies which have no duration. Evolution is blind and occurs without purpose. Therefore, from a Whiteheadian perspective, There is no explanation for the upward evolutionary trend we can find among living species. The survival of the fittest does not coincide with the best instantiations of life. And I quote from Function of Reason. In fact, life itself is comparatively deficient in survival value. The problem set by the doctrine of evolution is to explain how complex organisms with such deficient survival power ever evolved, unquote. The theory of evolution presupposes the progression of more complex organisms from previous, less elaborate organisms. There is an underlying activity that justifies the upward trend and ascribes value to each emerging organism. Organisms are no longer purposeless portions of matter. Evolving entities participate in a developing activity that moves upwards because it aims at better and more complex organic structures. Thus, the purpose of evolution can be nothing but the production of value. But how does materialism relate to all these processual conceptions I've been talking about? Why is our civilization in a crisis? Is it a reflection of materialistic frames of mind, of how we perceive the world? When we realize perception is a very important factor in our evaluation of the world, and even in our most basic conceptions necessary for our survival, we tend to not trust perception as a disinterested observation of the surrounding world. And although we do see what is real, as Bergson emphasized, we select what is necessary for our action upon the world. We hide ourselves behind the idea of a disinterested perception and of the opposition between subject and object. Our perception stays away from the natural world, and the objects in the world are separated from the perceiving subjects. However, that procedure jeopardizes our human condition. Our world is a bifurcated world. There is us, humans, and them, animals, plants, and other elements of nature like minerals or other organic complex structures. All these things are considered objects that can be appropriated by human subjects and not in the Whiteheadian sense of apprehension. These objects are seen as resources, no matter whether they are living or not. They can be taken and transformed into useful or playful things for human fruition. Our severance from nature makes it possible for us to appropriate other beings and turn them into resources. Resources have a price, often a high price, but resources are not valuable because their intrinsic value is overlooked. Value has been removed. Now these things have a price that erases any intrinsic worth. They are commodities that can be bought and sold in the markets, although they are frequently physically absent from those markets. They have been commodified, financialized, monetized. Their integrity, their intrinsic worthiness, even their usefulness have become irrelevant. They are sheer tools of speculative transactions. Sometimes they can even be discarded from the real economy, and they have been turned into mere financial vehicles. Bifurcating nature is thus an important strategy for some human societies to keep pace with our kind of civilization. If we were to consider nature as a whole, as a realm that includes civilized human beings like us, we would be at odds with our lifestyles and with our hard-earned entitlements. The Western civilized world has not only destroyed the ecosystems, eradicating thousands of animal and plant species, it has tried and partially succeeded in destroying human societies that lived in harmony with nature and respected it. These societies are usually designated as indigenous peoples, but the destruction of viable human societies encompasses much more than those societies who have retained their original, distinctive and authentic ways of living. We have even destroyed our own civilization as far as its practices were vernacular or merely well integrated into nature and social environment. The aim of globalization has been to eradicate culture in every little corner of the world. Cultural diversity and creativity have been replaced by homogeneous, uniform, one-size-fits-all routines that go as far as trying to eradicate our human condition. The bifurcation of nature comes with the fragmentation of the world around us. It emphasizes the opposition subject-object and refers to the materialistic paradigm, enhancing the erasement and disrespect for the temporal character of beings. As Bergson emphasized, analysis decomposes and recomposes things around us, getting a different thing from the initial one in the end. Life is not a reversible mathematical equation. Analysis, thus, is not a means of control and prediction of the development of the world. Fragmentation as a methodology excludes the ontological facet of things, making a superficial and incomplete examination of the world and its elements. The fragmentation of the world leads to the fragmentation of the minds and ideas. Breaking up the coherence of ideas leads to incomplete and unclear science. Social organizations become divided and uncoordinated. People work and live disconnected from each other. Different topics are taken in isolation and treated as disconnected bits that are put back together with no real purpose. Fragmentation obstructs realization, and realization needs wholeness, not fragmented ideas or unrelated and thus unorganized tasks. Reversing the process of division, that is, decomposing and recomposing, does not bring back the initial whole, and adding up the severed parts of a whole is mainly a useless effort. The failures in education and research show how badly needed is an all-encompassing methodology or an integral worldview. The common root of our multiple environmental crises is found in the bifurcation of nature and the fragmentation of reality. Saving the oceans or stopping oil will do very little for the integrity of our planet. These are only fragmented, isolated banner activisms which will not displace other equally fragmented views presented as highly acceptable policies, such as mining the seabed or increasing energy demand. Environmental disaster has been fragmented into different topics that have been dealt with separately. We may have saved the whales or diminished greatly the incomes of tobacco companies, but environmental destruction has ruined as much of our world as it possibly could. And the harder it gets to reverse the environmental damage and harm perpetrated over many decades, the more governments and big corporations focus on destructive, sometimes green, business that promotes economic growth and rampant consumerism. Fragmentation of reality has been essential to fracture our world and treat it as a pile of resources ready to be extracted for our convenience and comfort. The bifurcation of nature and the fragmentation of the real both ignore the passage of nature and thus the constitutional temporality of beings. According to process philosophy, beings differ amongst themselves in as far as they have diverse durations, different ways of enduring, and diverse rhythms of being. Our civilization has overcome the particularities of temporality, reducing everything to repetitive, lifeless gadgets and bits of uninterpreted information. We have stopped short of even knowing about the basic seasonality of our food. We demand to eat cucumbers in February and grapes in May. Every relevant good is available at any time. The consumer society supplies everything whenever consumers demand it. There are no seasonable restrictions. We have discarded all processes of maturation, be they physical or mental. The passage of time is completely irrelevant. But in passage, we find the very nature of the world. As Bergson taught us, change and movement are ultimately the primordial elements of reality. These events, as Whitehead sometimes called them, are real chunks of life. The denial of temporality is the denial of real life. It includes the denial of the past and thus the exclusion of culture, memory, and the very nature of things. Materialism as a fundamental philosophy which is anchored to every kind of contemporary theory and ideology has denied temporality and thus the living condition of most beings on Earth, including Mother Earth, herself a living being. As the environmental crisis grows relentlessly, it becomes ever more clear that we are at the crossroads of a systemic crisis, no longer compatible with our fragmented and materialistic frames of mind. The effacement and destruction of life on Earth overwhelms human civilization. And I end with a quote from Bergson's Two Sources. He writes at the very end of the Two Sources, "Humanity lies groaning, half crushed beneath the weight of its own progress. Human beings do not sufficiently realize that their future is in their own hands. Theirs is the task of determining, first of all, whether they want to go on living or not."